Most men abandon their fields in the season when the fields are most alive. The first farmer spent the dark, frozen months watching the surface of his land, waiting for visible signs before committing to any labor, reasoning that since nothing could be seen emerging from the ground, nothing was occurring beneath it. When the season turned, his field stood bare, offering back exactly what he had invested in the invisible months. Nothing. The second farmer understood what the first did not: that the most consequential work of any harvest takes place underground, in darkness, invisible to every instrument of observation available to the impatient eye. In the silent season when the seed is breaking open along its seams and the root system is pressing outward through cold soil, establishing the foundation whose depth will determine the height of everything that follows. He worked the ground in the cold. He planted in the dark. He tended what he could not see. And when spring arrived, his field erupted into visible abundance with the sudden force of something that had been building for months beneath a surface that offered no testimony to its labor. James Allen teaches that the human mind is precisely that field, and that the most consequential growth available to any person in this life will always, without exception, begin in a darkness that impatient men abandon before the harvest arrives. The modern mind has been conditioned, with extraordinary thoroughness, to require visible confirmation at every stage of any process it undertakes. This is not merely a personal preference or a temperamental tendency. It is a trained epistemic reflex, a deeply embedded assumption that the absence of observable output is equivalent to the absence of productive activity. If effort does not yield a measurable, visible result within a compressed time frame, the conclusion arrives quickly and with great confidence: the process is not working. Abandon it. Redirect the investment. Seek a more responsive field. This logic feels like discernment. It has been dressed in the modern era, in the language of efficiency and rational resource allocation. But James Allen exposes it for what it actually is: not wisdom, but a fundamental misunderstanding of how the law of inner cause and outer harvest operates. The assumption that the invisible is unproductive is not a careful reading of evidence. It is an error of metaphysical proportion. What makes this particular error so devastating is not merely that it causes the farmer to abandon a field that was already producing. Though it does, what makes it catastrophic is the precision of the moment at which abandonment typically occurs. The human mind, untrained in the patience that the silent season demands, tends to reach its threshold of tolerance at precisely the phase when the root system is at its most active and its most invisible. The seed, in the days before it breaks the surface, is undergoing its most intense structural transformation. The ground above it shows nothing. The farmer sees nothing. And it is in that specific window, that narrow, deceptive gap between invisible completion and visible emergence, that the untrained mind most reliably concludes that nothing is happening and withdraws. James Allen identifies this not as bad luck, not as a character flaw in any ordinary sense, but as the primary mechanism by which poverty of mind perpetuates itself across a lifetime. The field is not failing the farmer. The farmer is failing the field. By imposing on a law of nature the impatient demands of a mind that has never learned to read the darkness. The seed that is abandoned before it breaks the surface does not, in James Allen's understanding, simply fail. The language of failure is too clean for what actually occurs. A seed abandoned mid-germination carries within it all the momentum of a process already in motion. A process that is now interrupted, not concluded. The farmer who digs it up or withdraws his care at that juncture does not merely lose one harvest. He establishes, through that act, a pattern of abandonment whose own root system begins to spread through his beliefs and his habits, quietly teaching him, in the language of repeated experience, that the darkness never produces anything worth waiting for. And so the cycle tightens. The man who could not tolerate the invisible season becomes, over time, the man who is constitutionally incapable of producing a harvest. Not because the law refused to serve him, but because he trained himself, one abandoned seed at a time, to misread the silence that is the law's most productive phase. James Allen's teaching begins precisely here, at this specific and consequential misreading. And it offers not comfort, but correction. In what follows, the harvest principle of James Allen will be laid open with the full precision its author intended. A principle that governs, with the faithfulness of natural law, the conversion of inner poverty into outer abundance, and that operates in the darkness where no observer is present, where no metrics are recorded, and where the entire destiny of a man's outer life is being quietly assembled from the seeds his inner life has planted. This is not a collection of encouragements arranged for easy consumption. It is an examination of a law, specific, operative, and indifferent to whether it is understood or ignored. The law does not require belief to function. It does not accelerate for the eager or pause for the doubtful. It grows exactly what was planted at the rate that the inner soil and the nature of the seed determine, and it delivers its harvest with the same impersonal precision that the natural world delivers spring. What will be made clear in this examination is the exact nature of what is growing in the invisible season of your life right now. Not as a motivational projection, but as a logical consequence of what the principle actually states. Something is always growing in the field of the mind. The absence of visible outer change is not evidence of an inactive inner field. It is, in many cases, evidence of an inner field at its most productive. Understanding the distinction between these two conditions, the productive silence of a seed in active germination and the sterile silence of a field that was never planted, is the central competence that Allen's harvest principle transmits. Without it, the farmer cannot make a correct decision about his field. With it, every season of darkness becomes readable, workable, and purposeful. The promise of this examination is, therefore, not that you will be inspired. It is that you will be shown the architecture of a law, one that was operating before you were born, one that is operating in your life at this precise moment, and one that will continue to operate with or without your comprehension of it. The difference between the man who comprehends this law and the man who does not is not a difference in the law's behavior. It is a difference in what the farmer plants, how faithfully he tends it, and whether he possesses the inner quality that the silent season demands above all others. The patient, certain knowledge of a man who understands exactly what he planted, who therefore has no need to dig up the seed to confirm that it is alive, and who can work the dark months with the same focused diligence as the bright ones. Because he has understood that the darkness is not the absence of the harvest. It is the harvest's most essential condition. Allen teaches, with the precision of a man who has examined this principle from every angle that sustained philosophical inquiry can reach, that every outer condition a man inhabits was grown, not approximated, not influenced, but grown precisely and faithfully, without exception, from an inner seed planted in the invisible field of his mind and character. This is the foundational statement of the harvest principle, and it must be received with the full weight of its implication before anything else in Allen's teaching can be properly understood. It is not a poetic observation about the value of positive thinking. It is a claim about the nature of causation, that the inner and outer dimensions of a man's life are related not by correlation, but by the same absolute logical necessity that relates a seed to the plant it produces. The outer life is not a reflection of the inner life. It is the inner life, grown to the point of visibility. What makes this claim more than philosophy is the intermediate process Allen identifies with such care. The invisible stage between planting and harvest that most observers never think to examine. The seed of a thought does not leap immediately from conception to material consequence. It enters a period of germination that may be silent and invisible, for a duration that varies with the nature of the seed, the quality of the soil, and the consistency of the tending. During this period, the thought is not dormant. It is working, establishing itself in the deeper, less visible layers of the man's character, pressing its root threads through his habitual emotional responses, through his automatic assumptions about what is possible and what is not, through the subtle gradient of his daily inner atmosphere. It is building a structure, and the strength of that structure, the depth and reach of the root system, will determine with precise correspondence the height and durability of what eventually surfaces. This underground architecture is something most people never observe in themselves, because the instruments they use to examine their inner lives operate only at the surface level. A man will examine his thoughts as he is consciously aware of them, and he will find some that seem aligned with abundance, and some that do not. And he will conclude something moderate and manageable about his inner field. What he will not observe, what requires a different quality of self-examination entirely, is the root system that was already established long before the thoughts he is now consciously noticing ever appeared. Beneath the level of consciously observed thought, there is a deeper layer of assumption, of belief, of ingrained orientation toward reality, that functions as the actual soil in which every new thought either takes root deeply or fails to establish itself at all. Allen's harvest principle is addressed ultimately not to the conscious thought, but to this deeper ground. It is the quality of this inner ground that determines what can be grown there. Consider what this means for the man who observes that his outer life contains persistent poverty of material resources, of meaningful connection, of realized capacity. The common analysis of such a condition examines the outer circumstances and attributes them to forces external to the man. The economy, the timing, the advantages he lacked, the obstacles he encountered. Allen's analysis moves in the opposite direction entirely. It begins with the outer condition as a finished harvest and traces it backward, through the invisible season, through the germination period, through the root establishment, to the original seed from which it grew. The outer poverty is not the cause. It is not even a problem in itself. It is the end product of a specific inner planting, and it tells the careful observer, with great precision, exactly what was growing in the dark season of that man's inner life. This is not a punitive reading. It is a cartographic one. It shows the man exactly where he is, which is the only honest beginning of any navigation towards somewhere else. The precision of this causation is something Allen insists upon with unusual force. And for good reason, because it is precisely this precision that the ordinary mind finds most difficult to accept. It is far more comfortable to believe in a law that operates loosely, probabilistically, as a general tendency rather than an absolute correspondence. If the law is merely a tendency, then its failures can be attributed to the exceptions. and the man is relieved of the full burden of examining his inner field with honesty. But Allen will not permit this relief. He states the law as a correspondence of the same order as biological law. The same necessity that ensures a wheat seed produces wheat and not barley. That a thought of genuine inner poverty produces an outer condition of poverty and not abundance. The darkness does not editorialize. It does not select among what was planted according to what the farmer deserved. It grows what was planted, fully, silently, without deviation. This means that the man whose outer life contains abundance, real abundance, the kind that has depth and stability rather than the brittle appearance of prosperity built on a shallow root system, is not a man who was fortunate in his circumstances. He is a man who planted specific things in the invisible field of his character, tended them through the silent season with a consistency that most people never sustain, and then witnessed, with the quiet lack of surprise that belongs only to the man who understood what he planted, the faithful emergence of what the law was always going to produce. His harvest is not the reward for a good attitude. It is the exact and inevitable product of a specific inner cultivation. And this distinction between the harvest as reward and the harvest as law is the first thing Allen's teaching demands that the student understand completely before he can begin to work the field with any real competence. It is worth dwelling here, in this foundational layer of the principle, to examine why Allen's agricultural metaphor is not merely illustrative, but structurally precise. The metaphor of the seed and the harvest is not chosen for emotional resonance. It is chosen because it maps the actual mechanics of inner causation with a fidelity that more abstract language cannot match. In agricultural reality, the seed contains within its structure the complete genetic specification of the plant it will become. That specification is not created by the soil, or by the water, or by the sunlight. It is brought to the soil fully formed. And the function of the environment is to provide the conditions under which what is already specified within the seed can unfold into visibility. Allen's metaphysical claim is identical in structure. The thought, particularly the thought held consistently, with emotional conviction and reinforced through habitual inner repetition, carries within it the specification of the outer condition it will produce. The outer world provides the medium of manifestation, but the form of what manifests is determined entirely by what was planted, not by the medium. This architecture of inner causation has a further implication that Allen develops with considerable precision, and that most students of his work underestimate in their initial encounter with the principle. The root system of a mature thought, a thought that has been held consistently across months or years and has therefore had the opportunity to establish itself deeply in the strata of character and belief, is not neutralized by a single contrary thought planted at the surface level. A man who has spent years growing a dense, well-established root system of doubt, smallness, and inner poverty cannot simply plant one vigorous thought of abundance and expect that thought to produce a surface harvest quickly. The new seed must contend with the existing root architecture. It must establish itself in ground that is already extensively occupied. This does not mean the new planting is futile. It means it requires a quality of sustained cultivation that accounts for the depth of what it is working against. Allen's harvest principle is not a formula for instant transformation. It is a law of agricultural reality applied to the inner life, and it is as respectful of accumulated depth as any farmer working genuinely difficult soil must be. What then is the nature of the thought that Allen identifies as the correct seed for a harvest of outer abundance? This is a question that must be answered with care, because it is surrounded in the popular imagination by a great deal of imprecision. The seed Allen points to is not the thought of abundance as a wished-for future state, not the passive longing or the optimistic projection that mistakes desire for planting. The thought he identifies as genuinely generative is something of an entirely different substance. It is the thought that corresponds, in its inner texture and quality, to the outer condition being grown. Not as a hope, but as a present inner reality, a state of being inhabited with the consistency and conviction of a man who does not merely wish for a harvest, but has understood the law well enough to work the soil with certainty of what it will produce. The difference between these two categories of thought, the wish and the living inner state, is the entire distance between a seed placed in the soil and a seed held above it. This distinction brings Allen's principle into direct contact with the most common and most costly error made by people who have encountered his work at a surface level and applied it without the depth of understanding it requires. They approach the inner field with the posture of a petitioner, holding positive thoughts as requests directed toward a universe they hope will respond favorably, but without the root system of an inner life that has been genuinely cultivated into alignment with what they seek. The thought they plant is sincere, but shallow. It lands on a surface that is densely occupied by the root system of the contrary belief that has been growing there for years. And when the harvest fails to appear on the visible surface with the speed they expected, they conclude one of two things. Either the law is not real, or they are uniquely excluded from its operation. Allen's analysis is more precise than either of these conclusions. The law is real, and they are not excluded, and they simply misunderstood what constitutes planting. Genuine planting, in Allen's framework, requires that the thought penetrate the surface of conscious intention and begin the process of root establishment in the deeper layers of character. This penetration is not accomplished by the single act of conceiving the thought. No matter how clearly or forcefully, it is accomplished through repetition, through the daily, disciplined return to the same inner quality, the same inner orientation, until what began as a deliberately chosen thought has become an automatic assumption, an unconscious default, a permanent feature of the man's inner atmosphere. This is the transformation of a planted seed into an established root system, and it takes exactly as long as it takes. No amount of desire or urgency on the farmer's part accelerates the biological reality of the germination process. The law is not responsive to the farmer's emotional intensity in the moment of planting. It is responsive to the depth and consistency of the cultivation that follows. There is a quality of attention available to the inner life that is entirely different from the quality of attention most people bring to their conscious thought processes. And Allen's harvest principle is addressed specifically to this deeper quality. The surface mind skims. It reacts. It moves from one impression to the next with a responsiveness that is appropriate for navigating immediate circumstances, but entirely inadequate for the work of inner cultivation. The deeper quality of attention required to work the invisible field is more akin to what classical philosophy names contemplation, a sustained, unhurried dwelling within a particular quality of inner experience, not in order to analyze it or evaluate it, but in order to allow it to deepen and spread its roots through the layers of character that lie beneath the level of active thought. This is the attention that plants seeds that stay planted. It is the attention of a farmer who understands that the most important work he does today will not be visible until a season that is not yet present. The man who has understood the underground architecture of Allen's harvest principle will encounter his outer circumstances with a fundamentally different quality of inner relation than the man who has not. He will not look at a surface that shows nothing growing and conclude that the law has failed him. He will read the bare surface as testimony to the phase of the process he is currently in, the invisible season, and he will direct his attention not to the surface, but to the quality of what he is planting and how consistently he is tending it. This is not optimism. Optimism is a disposition of temperament that hopes for good outcomes without possessing knowledge of the mechanism that produces them. What Allen's man possesses is something closer to what classical philosophy names episteme, a form of understanding that rests not on hope, but on the comprehension of law. He does not hope the seed will grow. He knows what it contains. He knows the law that governs its development, and he tends it accordingly, with the patience that belongs not to endurance, but to understanding. The underground architecture of a thought reaching toward harvest is not ultimately a private and sealed process, though it appears so on the surface. It is a process that, as it matures, begins to subtly alter every dimension of the man who is growing it. His bearing, his quality of attention when he encounters other people, the nature of the questions he asks, the character of the problems he perceives as solvable, the invisible signal his presence communicates to the world around him, long before the outer conditions of his life shift in any way that can be measured. The man whose inner field is in active, deep germination becomes, in some precise and unquantifiable way, different. And this difference is already drawing toward him the conditions of his harvest, along channels that the surface mind will not recognize until the moment of visible convergence. The harvest does not begin when it becomes visible. It began the moment the seed was planted deeply enough to start moving. What finally does it mean to understand, Nanichainen, that the most important work of any harvest takes place in darkness, underground, invisible to every eye? It means recognizing that the invisibility of the process is not a design flaw or a cosmic indifference. It is the actual mechanism of the law's operation. The root must establish itself in the dark, because the dark is where the soil's full resistance and full nutriment are available simultaneously. The seed that must push through the cold resistance of winter ground to establish its root system does so only because it must. And in doing so, it builds a depth of foundation that seeds planted in easy, open, already prepared ground never achieve. Allen's silent law produces its most durable harvests from the seeds that were planted in the deepest, coldest, most invisible seasons of a man's inner life. Not despite the darkness, but because of it. The darkness is not the obstacle. It is the condition. And the farmer who has understood this does not ask to be spared it. He asks only for the clarity to plant the right seed, and the discipline to tend it until the surface reveals what the darkness was growing all along. James Allen does not present the harvest principle as a philosophical preference or a spiritually satisfying way of thinking about the relationship between inner life and outer circumstance. He presents it as a law, a principle of the same logical order and the same inescapable force as the laws that govern the physical world. And he insists on this characterization with a precision that must be examined carefully, because it carries an implication that most people, even those who encounter his work with genuine seriousness, fail to absorb in its full consequence. A law does not admit of exceptions. A law does not produce its results more faithfully for some practitioners than for others. A law does not respond to a man's desire to be exempt from its operation. It operates continuously, impersonally, with the same absolute faithfulness, in the case of the man who understands it, as in the case of the man who has never heard of it. This is the first and most important dimension of the harvest principle's unshakable logic. It is already operating in your life, in its full precision, whether or not you have decided to work with it consciously. The implication of this fact is one that requires a particular quality of intellectual honesty to receive. If the principle is indeed a law, if the outer life is the exact and faithful harvest of the inner planting, then the man who looks at his present outer circumstances and finds them unsatisfactory is not looking at evidence of the law's absence. He is looking at evidence of the law's perfect operation. The poverty he sees in his outer world is not the result of a world that failed to respond. It is the result of an inner field that planted precisely what is now growing. This is not a comfortable reading of the evidence, and Allen is not primarily interested in comfort. He is interested in clarity, because clarity, in his framework, is the beginning of genuine cultivation. And cultivation is the beginning of a different harvest. The man who misreads his poverty as evidence of an external obstacle will look outward for its correction. The man who understands it as a faithful harvest will look inward, with the precise and purposeful attention of a farmer examining his soil. There is another dimension to the unshakable logic of this law that must be confronted directly, because it closes every avenue of evasion that the ordinary mind will attempt to open. If the law operates without exception, then the question of whether it applies to any particular man is already answered. It does. The man who objects that his circumstances are the product of forces beyond his inner life, historical, economic, social, accidental, is making a claim that Allen's law does not deny in its particulars, but overrides in its principle. Allen does not claim that outer circumstances have no effect on the material conditions of a man's life. He claims something more fundamental, that the man's inner response to those circumstances, held consistently over time, is a planting, and that the harvest of that inner response will become, in the fullness of the law's operation, the dominant condition of his outer life. The man who plants thoughts of inner sovereignty in ground that is also occupied by genuine external difficulty is not planting in defiance of reality. He is planting the root system that will, in the silent season, establish itself deeply enough to alter what his reality is capable of producing. This logic is airtight in a way that must be understood not merely as a philosophical claim, but as a practical directive. It removes, permanently and completely, the option of blaming the outer world for the inner harvest, not because the outer world is irrelevant, but because the inner field is, in the final accounting, the more powerful causal agent. A man who grasps this genuinely, not as an inspiring idea, but as a fact about the structure of causation, will never again invest his inner energy in resentment of his circumstances, because he will have understood that resentment is itself a planting, growing in the silent darkness toward a harvest of further constraint. He will not direct his inner energy toward the outer world as a petitioner seeking favorable conditions. He will direct it downward, into the root system, into the quality of what is germinating in the deepest layers of his character, because that is where the harvest is actually determined. The logic of the law also carries a specific implication about time that most people find deeply challenging. The harvest cannot be rushed, not through greater emotional intensity, not through more determined effort applied in short bursts, not through the deployment of technique or the application of strategy at the surface level. The germination of a deeply planted thought follows the same essential logic as the germination of a seed in physical soil. It requires the duration it requires, and that duration is determined by the depth of the planting, the quality of the soil, and the consistency of the tending, not by the farmer's desire for early results. Allen's insistence on this point is not fatalistic. He is not saying that the harvest cannot be accelerated through the quality of the cultivation. What he is saying is that no amount of impatience changes the law's timeline, and that impatience, because it is itself an inner planting, actively works against the harvest the impatient man claims to want. Consider the specific mechanism by which impatience undermines the harvest. A man plants a thought of genuine abundance in the inner field. He tends it with real discipline for a period of time, days, weeks, perhaps a few months. The surface of his outer life shows no change. He begins to feel the internal pressure of the question he has been avoiding. What if it isn't working? That question is not merely a thought. It is a seed carried into the inner field on the force of the emotional urgency that accompanies it. And it lands in soil that has been carefully prepared by the man's own cultivation practice. Which means it lands in good soil, and it begins to root with the same law-governed faithfulness as every other seed that has been planted there. The man now has two root systems developing simultaneously in the same field. The root system of the abundance he is trying to grow, and the root system of the doubt that will, if allowed to develop, strangle it. Allen's law does not play favorites between these two plantings. It grows both with identical precision, and the harvest will be determined by which root system the farmer chose to tend. The unshakable logic of the principle extends further still, into a dimension that most treatments of Allen's work pass over too quickly. The law's operation is cumulative in a way that dramatically increases in force as the root system deepens. A thought that has been consistently held and actively tended for 1 week has a root system of a certain depth. The same thought, held and tended with the same consistency for 1 year, does not merely have a root system 52 times deeper. It has a root system that has reached into the foundational strata of the man's character, into the bedrock of his automatic responses and unconscious assumptions, where it begins to reshape the soil itself, making the inner field fundamentally more receptive to the harvest it is growing. This is the compounding logic of inner cultivation, and it means that the man who persists through the silent season gains not merely more of the same progress, but a qualitatively different relationship with the law. One in which the law's operation becomes, from the inside, increasingly self-evident and self-reinforcing. There is a test that Allen's logic implies, one that can be applied with clinical precision to any man's inner life. The test is this: examine what you believe to be inevitable about your own life. Not what you hope for, not what you desire, not what you are working toward, but what you believe at the deepest level of your inner operating assumptions to be the inescapable shape of what your life will contain. This belief, held below the level of conscious aspiration, operating as the unconscious background against which all your conscious efforts play out, is the truest testimony to what your inner field has been growing in the silent season. It is the most honest answer to the question of what you planted. A man may articulate great and genuine ambitions at the surface level of his mind, and yet carry, in the bedrock of his character, an assumption that those ambitions will ultimately be frustrated by forces beyond his control. That assumption is a root system. It is growing toward a harvest, and it will, in the fullness of the law's operation, produce its fruit with the same faithfulness as every other planting, regardless of what the man says he wants. This is why Allen's harvest principle demands, as its most fundamental requirement, a quality of inner honesty that most people never bring to the examination of their own beliefs. The surface mind is an unreliable witness to the actual state of the inner field. It will report what the man wishes to believe about himself, that he is genuinely committed, genuinely faithful, genuinely cultivating in the right direction. Even while the deeper layers of his character are producing, through the law's impersonal operation, a harvest that contradicts every one of those reports. The work that Allen's principle requires is not the work of thinking different thoughts at the conscious level. It is the deeper and more demanding work of reaching below the level of conscious thought to examine, and, where necessary, to deliberately alter the root-level assumptions that constitute the actual soil of the inner field. This is the work that happens in the dark, that no one else can see or verify, and that determines everything. It is worth pausing here to confront the objection that the most logically rigorous mind will inevitably raise at this point. If the law is as precise and as impersonal as Allen claims, does it not then remove the significance of circumstance entirely? Does it reduce every human difficulty to inner failure, every outer poverty to inner poverty, every injustice to a planting that could have been otherwise? Allen's answer to this objection is not a comfortable one, but it is a logically consistent one. He does not claim that outer circumstances are wholly irrelevant, or that every man's inner field is equally fertile, or that the seeds available to different men are equally rich. He claims something more fundamental, that whatever a man's circumstances, his inner response to them is a planting, and that the harvest of that inner planting will, in the fullness of time, become the dominant shaping force of his experience. The law does not ignore circumstance. It operates through character. And character, in Allen's framework, is the instrument by which the man shapes his response to circumstance, and through that response shapes what the law will grow. The logic of the harvest principle also contains within it a specific and rather profound reading of what failure actually is. And this reading is worth developing with precision because it overturns the most common and most disabling interpretation of failure that the ordinary mind employs. When a man's outer efforts produce unsatisfactory results, the conventional interpretation is that something went wrong in the outer world, that the plan was flawed, the execution inadequate, the conditions unfavorable. Allen's law proposes a different reading. The outer result was faithful. It was accurate. It told the farmer exactly what was growing in the inner field at the time of the harvest, with a precision that no other instrument of self-knowledge can match. Failure, in this framework, is not a deviation from the law's operation. It is the law's operation, delivering its harvest of a specific inner planting with the same faithfulness that success delivers the harvest of another. The value of this reframing is not philosophical consolation. It is navigational. It tells the farmer exactly where to look to understand what must change. Not in the outer conditions, but in the root system from which those conditions grew. The unshakable logic of the principle reaches its most demanding expression in the question of what the man must do in the dark season. In the period of invisible germination, when the law is operating fully, but the surface shows nothing, the logic demands that the farmer tend the field with identical diligence in the dark season as in the visible one, because the law's operation in the dark season is identical to its operation in any other phase. The thought being tended is growing its root system during this phase. The thought being abandoned is also growing. The abandonment is itself a planting. The law does not recognize the dark season as a period of suspension or waiting. From the law's perspective, the dark season is the most active period of cultivation, because it is during this phase that the root system is establishing itself in the deepest strata of the inner field. The farmer who understands this will not reduce his attention or his discipline during the dark season. he will intensify it. Precisely because he understands that this is when the most fundamental work is being done. What the unshakable logic of the harvest principle ultimately reveals is a portrait of two men who are outwardly indistinguishable at the beginning of the silent season, but inwardly separated by a difference that will, in the fullness of the law's operation, produce outer lives of radical contrast. Both men face the same surface, bare, offering no testimony to what is or is not growing beneath it. Both men experience the same pressure of the dark season, the absence of visible reward, the quiet but persistent demand of inner doubt. The comparison with others whose fields seem further along, the first man, lacking the understanding that the darkness is the law's most productive phase, treats the absence of visible result as meaningful evidence about the inner process and adjusts his behavior accordingly, withdrawing his cultivation, redirecting his energy, planting new seeds in the hope that a different choice will produce a quicker surface result. The second man, equipped with Allen's law as a working instrument of inner navigation, reads the bare surface correctly, not as evidence of an inactive field, but as testimony to the phase he is in, and tends his planting with the quiet, unhurried diligence of one who already knows what the spring will reveal, because he has understood what the darkness contains. Wattles teaches, in the formless substance that permeates and constitutes all things, that the universe possesses a creative intelligence, a thinking substance that responds to the mental images impressed upon it with faith, and a quality of inner gratitude that is itself an acknowledgement of the harvest as already real. The process Wattles describes is not metaphorical. It is a precise account of how the mental form held with consistency and conviction in the mind of the individual becomes impressed upon the creative medium of the universe, initiating a process of materialization that moves through channels invisible to ordinary observation before producing the visible result that the mental image specified. This is the metaphysics of the formless substance, that the inner image is the sufficient cause of the outer form, and that between the impression and the form, when there is a period of invisible creative process, that the man who planted the image must sustain his faith through, without interruption and without the demand for premature visible evidence. James Allen provides something that Wattles presupposes but does not fully map: the agricultural anatomy of the invisible process itself. Wattles tells the student that the seed planted in the formless substance will grow, that the mental image held with faith will move through invisible channels toward its material expression. What Allen adds to this is a precise description of the soil in which that process actually takes place, the medium through which the formless substance's creative activity moves on its way to visible expression. That soil is the man's character, the deep inner ground of his beliefs, his habitual emotional responses, his automatic assumptions about the nature of reality and the scope of what is available to him. This is the ground that Wattles' seed must take root in before it can move outward into the material world. This is the layer that must be cultivated, prepared, and cleared of competing root systems if the impression upon the formless substance is to produce its full and faithful harvest. This is why the two teachings, Allen's law of inner cultivation and Wattles' law of creative impression, are not merely compatible, but architecturally interdependent. A man who reads Wattles without Allen will understand the cosmic mechanism of the harvest, but may misunderstand the nature of the soil. He may attempt to impress mental images upon the formless substance from a character that is still densely occupied by the root systems of contrary beliefs, and he will find that his impressions do not take hold with the depth or stability that the process requires. He is planting in unprepared ground. The seed carries the correct specification. Wattles' law is operative. But the soil offers insufficient support for the depth of root establishment that a mature harvest requires. Allen's teaching is the preparation of that soil. It is the prior and necessary work of inner cultivation that makes the impression Wattles describes possible in its full creative force. The man who understands both teachings simultaneously understands something of extraordinary practical consequence, that the invisible season is not a period of waiting during which the farmer has nothing to do. It is the period of the law's most intensive operation, in which both the inner cultivation Allen describes and the creative process Wattles describes are simultaneously active and mutually reinforcing. The man who tends his inner field with the discipline Allen prescribes, who substitutes, daily and consistently, the thought of genuine inner abundance for the spontaneous thought of lack, is simultaneously deepening the impression upon the formless substance that Wattles identifies as the mechanism of materialization. The two processes are not sequential. They are concurrent, and the dark season in which they operate simultaneously is not a period of suspended activity. It is the most densely productive period in the entire arc of the harvest. There is a further dimension to this conjunction of teachings that reveals something about the nature of the creative process that neither Allen nor Wattles makes fully explicit on its own, but that becomes clear when the two are read in precise relation to each other. Wattles places great emphasis on the quality of faith and gratitude with which the mental image is held, not as a moral requirement, but as a functional one. Faith and gratitude, in his framework, are the specific inner states that allow the impression to penetrate deeply into the formless substance and initiate the creative process with sufficient force. Allen's teaching reveals why these states are functionally necessary. They are the states of a man whose inner field has been cultivated to a sufficient depth of genuine inner conviction that the image being held is not experienced as a wish or a hope, but as a present inner reality, whose outer expression is a matter of law rather than chance. The man who holds the mental image with genuine faith is not a man who has decided to believe something difficult. He is a man who has done the inner cultivation work Allen describes, and has thereby established a root system deep enough that the image rests in genuinely prepared ground. His faith is not a posture. It is the natural inner atmosphere of a well-cultivated field. What this means for the student who is genuinely seeking to understand the mechanics of the invisible process is that the path begins not with the impression of the mental image upon the formless substance, important as that is, but with the prior work of the inner field. The quality of the harvest Wattles promises is bounded by the depth of the inner cultivation Allen requires. A man who has done genuine inner work, who has replaced, through consistent daily practice, the root system of lack belief with the establishing root system of genuine inner abundance, brings to his impression upon the formless substance a quality of conviction and inner substance that the man who has attempted only the surface level cognitive shift cannot approach. His mental image carries with it the full weight of a character that has been genuinely prepared to receive what the image specifies. And that weight, the accumulated mass of a deeply cultivated inner orientation, is precisely what determines the depth of the impression, and therefore the faithfulness and completeness of the harvest that the invisible process will eventually deliver. The understanding of these two teachings in conjunction also resolves a confusion that torments many sincere students of both Allen and Wattles. The confusion about what it means to live as though the harvest has already arrived, before the visible evidence supports that claim. This instruction, misunderstood, produces a kind of forced performance, a behavior of false confidence that sits on an unchanged inner foundation, and therefore lacks the root depth required to actually impress the formless substance, or cultivate the inner field in the way either teacher describes. Understood correctly, through the lens of their conjunction, it means something entirely different. To live as though the harvest has already arrived is to maintain, in the dark season, the inner quality of a man whose character has been sufficiently cultivated that the condition he is growing toward is already present in him as an inner reality, already rooted in the deep strata of his belief, his automatic assumption, his unconscious orientation. The outer form has not yet surfaced, but the root system is real. And the man who lives from that root system is not performing confidence. He is expressing the natural inner atmosphere of a field that is genuinely in active, deep germination. The formless substance, as Wattles describes it, is not an entity that can be deceived by surface performance. It responds to the actual quality of the inner impression, to the true depth of the root system that underlies the mental image being held. This is why Allen's insistence on genuine inner cultivation, as opposed to the maintenance of a positive thought performance, is not merely a philosophical nicety, but a functional requirement of Wattles' own system. The man who has done the real work, who has reached down into the deepest layers of his character and planted there, through sustained discipline, the genuine inner substance of what he seeks to grow, brings to the formless substance an impression of a fundamentally different quality and depth than the man who has held positive thoughts at the surface level, while the contrary root system continues to occupy the deep strata of his belief. The law responds to depth. It always has. The darkness grows what was planted deepest. Wattles identifies, with considerable emphasis, what he considers the single most dangerous error available to the man who is genuinely planted in the formless substance and is navigating the invisible season of the law's operation. The loss of faith at precisely the moment when the creative process is nearing its threshold of visible emergence. He frames this error not as an understandable human weakness, but as a functional catastrophe, a withdrawal of the inner force that was sustaining the creative process at its most critical phase, equivalent in its consequence to a farmer cutting off the water supply to his field 3 days before harvest. The visible surface shows nothing. The inner process is at its most advanced stage of invisible completion, and the man, unable to tolerate the darkness any longer, withdraws his faith, abandons the mental image, and plants in its place the seed of confirmed doubt. Wattles treats this error as the defining distinction between the man who harvests and the man who does not. Not because of capacity, not because of circumstance, but because of this single, specific, catastrophically timed failure of inner persistence. Allen explains, with a precision that Wattles' more cosmological account cannot provide, exactly why this failure is so common and so consistently timed at the worst possible moment. The dark season produces a specific inner pressure that compounds over time. As the period of invisible germination extends without visible surface evidence, the man's inner field begins to accumulate a particular kind of root system. The root system of a doubt that is not merely an intellectual question, but an emotionally charged interpretation of the evidence. The bare surface is experienced not merely as neutral information about the current phase of the process, but as accumulating testimony against the law's operation in this particular case. Each day of bare surface adds another layer to this root system of doubt, and each addition makes the next one more automatic. until the doubt is no longer a consciously chosen conclusion, but an unconscious background assumption. The soil in which every new attempt to hold the mental image now lands. At this point, the man is not merely doubting. He is farming doubt, with all the faithfulness of the law that governs all planting, and the harvest of that farming is the very failure he feared most. The implication of this analysis is one that reveals the full severity of what abandonment during the dark season actually produces. It is not merely the loss of the current harvest, though it is that. It is the establishment, through the law's faithful operation, of a root system of confirmed failure that will make the next planting more difficult, require deeper cultivation to overcome, and produce, if untended, a soil so densely occupied by the root system of doubt confirmed by experience that subsequent plantings of abundance will struggle to establish any depth at all. This is the compounding cost of impatient abandonment that Allen's analysis makes visible. Each time the farmer digs up the seed before it surfaces, he does not merely lose one harvest. He deepens the contrary root system in his inner field, making every subsequent harvest of abundance harder to grow, and every harvest of confirmed poverty more automatic and self-sustaining. The dark season that was abandoned becomes, through the law's operation, the teacher of a lesson the farmer never intended to learn. The lesson that tending the invisible field is futile, and that the darkness never contains what it promised. The harvest principle, understood at this depth, demands something far more specific and demanding than a general attitude of patience or a vague commitment to persisting through difficulty. It demands what Allen describes as a quality of inner understanding that is fundamentally different from mere endurance. Endurance tolerates the dark season. It suffers through the absence of visible result with gritted determination, held in place by force of will. But endurance is a surface posture, and surface postures, like surface plantings, do not root deeply enough to withstand the full pressure of the dark season. What the harvest principle requires is not endurance, but comprehension. The genuine inner understanding of why the darkness is the most productive phase, what the invisible process is actually doing during the silent season, and what it means at the level of law rather than hope. That the silence is not emptiness. The man who persists through the dark season because he understands it will persist differently than the man who endures it because he has decided to. His inner quality during that persistence is itself a planting. His comprehension of the law is itself a deepening of the root system. And this is the crucial distinction that separates the farmer who eventually harvests from the one who eventually abandons. Not willpower, but understanding. There is a specific inner quality that Allen identifies as the farmer's most essential instrument for navigating the dark season successfully. And it is worth naming with precision here. It is the capacity to distinguish between the productive silence of a seed in active germination and the sterile silence of a field that was never planted. This distinction is not observable at the surface level. Both conditions look identical from above the soil. Both are silent, both are bare. Both offer no visible testimony to what they contain. The distinction is knowable only through the farmer's understanding of what was planted and when, and through his ongoing attention to the quality of his inner cultivation. The man who has done genuine inner work, who has planted real seeds in real soil with real consistency, possesses a specific quality of inner knowledge that the man who planted nothing does not have access to. He knows what is in the ground because he is the one who put it there. And this knowledge, not optimism, not positive thinking, not forced confidence, but the specific inner knowing of the man who planted and tended with genuine discipline is the instrument by which the harvest principle is navigated through the dark season without abandonment. Allen is specific and demanding on the question of what genuine inner cultivation actually consists of. And his specificity here is worth dwelling in at length because the popular understanding of inner work is so thoroughly corrupted by the vocabulary and assumptions of a later era that Allen's actual prescription is almost always misread at first encounter. Inner cultivation, in Allen's framework, is not the maintenance of a positive emotional tone. It is not the practice of gratitude exercises or visualization routines or the management of one's self-talk toward an encouraging register. These are surface activities, activities conducted at the level of consciously observed thought, with no guaranteed penetration into the deeper strata of character and belief that constitute the actual soil of the inner field. Allen's prescription for genuine cultivation is, by contrast, active, daily, disciplined inner work conducted at a depth that requires something the ordinary mind is not practiced in. The sustained, discomfort-tolerating examination of what is actually growing in the field, followed by the deliberate act of substitution, not once in a dramatic moment of resolution, but thousands of times across the long, unwitnessed arc of the silent season. The central practice that Allen's inner cultivation requires is thought substitution, not thought suppression, not thought avoidance, but the active, disciplined replacement of every spontaneous thought, whose nature, if planted consistently, would grow a harvest of poverty, constraint, or diminishment. This distinction between suppression and substitution is not a nuance. It is an architectural difference with profound consequences. The man who suppresses the thought of lack does not neutralize its planting potential. He merely drives it underground, where it continues to root in the deeper strata of his character beyond the reach of his conscious management, often with greater force than it would have had if acknowledged and directly engaged. The man who substitutes, who meets the spontaneous thought of lack with the deliberate thought of genuine inner abundance, and holds that deliberate thought long enough to allow it to begin its own root establishment, is doing something entirely different. He is not merely managing his conscious mental atmosphere. He is engaged in active soil preparation, clearing the field of the root system that occupies it, and introducing the root system that will grow a different harvest. The scale of this practice is something Allen does not permit to be minimized. He is aware, with the clarity of a man who has performed this work on himself, that the spontaneous thoughts of lack that constitute the existing root system do not present themselves once a day in a single, clearly labeled form that can be efficiently addressed. They present themselves hundreds of times daily, in the background noise of anxious assumption, in the automatic interpretation of ambiguous events as threatening, in the unexamined emotional responses to the behavior of others, in the quiet but persistent inner monologue that assigns probability to the future based on the evidence of the past. Each of these is a spontaneous planting. Each one, if met with nothing, roots itself more deeply in the existing root system, and each one, if met with a disciplined act of substitution, with the deliberate return to the inner quality that the farmer is cultivating, adds one more layer of root depth to the harvest that is growing in the dark. The work is not dramatic. It does not happen in peak moments of inner resolution. It happens in the 10,000 small, unwitnessed moments of the ordinary day, each one a micro-cultivation of the field that will eventually produce the harvest. What Allen prescribes as the standard for this inner cultivation is private integrity. A standard maintained not for the benefit of any audience, including the man's own self-image. But for the functional reason that the law responds to the actual quality of what is planted, not to what the man sincerely believes he is planting or what he reports to others about the quality of his inner work. Private integrity, in Allen's usage, means the maintenance of inner standards in unobserved moments with the same exactness as in the most closely examined ones. Not because observation is the relevant force, but because the root system being cultivated does not distinguish between observed and unobserved moments. It grows from everything that is planted in it, regardless of the presence or absence of witnesses. The man who maintains his inner cultivation practice only when the evidence of his progress is visible, or only when his commitment is being tested in ways he is emotionally prepared for, is not building the root system that the silent season demands. He is building a root system of conditional cultivation, and the harvest of that will be a conditional outer life, one that works under favorable conditions and collapses in the dark. The invisible work that Allen describes, the practice of thought substitution at scale, the maintenance of private inner integrity, the daily return to the quality of inner being that the desired harvest requires, builds, over time, something that has no name in the modern vocabulary, but the classical philosophy would recognize under the term habituation, the gradual transformation of a deliberately chosen orientation into an automatic one, a modification of the man's default inner responses, that is, in its mature form, not experienced as effort at all, but as the natural expression of who he has become. This is the deepening of the root system past the point of conscious cultivation and into the bedrock of character itself. The phase where the plant's root structure is so established that it no longer requires daily tending to maintain its depth, and the farmer's energy can be redirected from root establishment to the active preparation of the harvest. Allen identifies this transformation of deliberate practice into automatic character as the real indicator of progress in the inner field, not a shift in outer circumstances, but a shift in what the man does naturally, without effort and without audience, in the unobserved moments of the ordinary day. That is the harvest indicator. That is how the farmer knows his planting is real. The question of what it costs to maintain genuine inner cultivation through the full duration of the silent season is one that Allen approaches with complete honesty and without softening. The cost is the sustained experience of working without visible return, of investing consistent inner energy in a field that shows, at the surface level, nothing growing. This experience is not painful in the dramatic sense that the word suggests. It is demanding in a quieter and more persistent way. The way that sustained attention to something unspectacular is always demanding. The way that private discipline in the absence of external reinforcement is always demanding. Most people possess, in Allen's observation, an inner economy that requires visible return to sustain investment, that allocates inner energy toward activities that produce legible feedback and withdraws it from activities that do not. The inner cultivation of the silent season produces no legible feedback in the early phases. The surface shows nothing. The only return available to the farmer during this phase is the increasing depth of his understanding of the law, and that return is available only to the man who has committed to working the inner field, not for what it will give him in the immediate moment, but for what the law, faithfully and without exception, will produce in the fullness of the silent season. The work that cannot be seen is also the work that cannot be faked. And this fact has a practical consequence that is worth stating with complete clarity. The inner cultivation that Allen prescribes cannot be simulated at the surface level in a way that produces the harvest it grows. A man may perform the outward behaviors associated with inner cultivation. He may articulate the correct principles demonstrate the correct attitudes in conversation, surround himself with the language and imagery of abundance. And none of this will constitute planting in the sense that Allen's law requires, unless the inner work of root establishment has actually been done in the invisible strata of his character. The law does not harvest performances. It harvests what was genuinely planted in the actual soil of the inner field. And the inner field is not accessible to surface performance. It is accessible only to the specific, disciplined, unspectacular inner work that Allen describes. The daily, thousandfold practice of thought substitution, the maintenance of private integrity, the sustained quality of inner attention that reaches below the level of consciously observed thought and begins the slow, unglamorous, necessary work of altering the root-level assumptions that constitute the soil in which every seed of the outer life is grown. The failure mode that Allen identifies most frequently and treats with the greatest analytical precision is not the failure of those who never attempt genuine inner cultivation. It is the failure of those who attempt it genuinely, sustain it faithfully for a period, and then, confronted with the bare surface of a life that shows no visible response to their inner work, arrive at a conclusion that feels, from the inside, like honest and rational assessment. But that is, in Allen's analysis, the most destructive and self-confirming error available to the man who is growing a harvest. The premature conclusion that the law does not work. This is not a failure of will. It is a failure of understanding, and it is precisely its disguise as rational assessment that makes it so consistently devastating and so difficult to interrupt once it has begun to root. The man who arrives at this premature conclusion does not typically announce it to himself in those terms. The conclusion does not arrive as a sudden loss of faith, but as a gradual accumulation of evidence. A series of small, individually reasonable reinterpretations of the bare surface, each one adding a thread to the root system of confirmed failure. First, the absence of visible result is noted as a curiosity. Then, as the silent season extends, it is noted as a concern. Then, as the concern accumulates, it is noted as significant evidence about the quality of the planting. And finally, when the inner weight of that accumulated evidence reaches a certain density, the man makes a decision that feels like intellectual honesty, but is, in its actual effect, a planting of the most potent kind. The conclusion that confirms what was feared, delivered with the full force of personal experience as testimony. At that moment, the root system of confirmed failure receives its deepest and most established planting of all, and the harvest it will produce will be, when it surfaces, far more difficult to overturn than any root system of genuine abundance that the man's original cultivation was growing. Allen is surgical on the timing of this failure because its timing is what makes it most tragic. The man who abandons the field 3 days before the seed would have broken the surface is not merely unlucky. He is the victim of a precise and common misreading of a specific phase of the process. The phase in which the inner germination is at its most complete, the root system most deeply established, and the surface breakthrough most imminent. And yet the visible evidence offers no testimony to any of this. The darkness looks the same on day 1 and on the day before emergence. The bare surface offers no differentiation between the early silence of a field that has just been planted and the late silence of a field that is days away from erupting into visible harvest. The only thing that differentiates these two moments is the farmer's knowledge of what was planted and when. His inner relationship with the timeline of the law. And it is precisely this knowledge that the impatient mind fails to maintain through the full duration of the silent season. What the premature conclusion sets in motion extends far beyond the loss of the immediate harvest. And this extension is worth tracing with precision because it reveals the full logic of why Allen treats this failure mode with such emphasis. The man who abandons the field at the moment of near harvest and concludes that the law does not work has, through that act of conclusion, performed a very specific and very consequential inner operation. He has reinterpreted the entire arc of his cultivation practice as evidence of the futility of cultivation. He has converted the experience of a harvest abandoned before emergence into a lesson about the nature of the law itself, and that lesson, the lesson that inner cultivation does not produce outer harvest, that the silent season is indeed empty, that the darkness contains nothing, is now planted in the deepest soil available in his inner field. The soil of personally validated, experientially confirmed belief. This is the most fertile planting possible, and what it will grow, with the same impersonal faithfulness that Allen's law always operates with, is a future in which cultivation feels pointless from the very beginning. Because the man already knows, from personal experience of this irrefutable evidence, what it produces. This is the mechanism by which poverty of mind propagates itself across time with such remarkable efficiency. Not through laziness, not through ignorance in the ordinary sense, but through the conversion of abandoned harvests into confirmed beliefs about the futility of planting. Each abandoned field adds another layer to the root system of this confirmed belief. Each layer makes the next planting less deep, the next period of sustained cultivation shorter, the next surface scrutiny more searching and more certain in its interpretation of bare ground as evidence of failure. Over time, the man who began as a genuine aspirant, who planted real seeds, tended them with real discipline, and then abandoned them at a specific and catastrophically timed moment, becomes, through the law's faithful operation, the man who cannot sustain the inner cultivation long enough to produce any harvest at all. Not because the law abandoned him, because he taught himself, one abandoned field at a time, that the darkness contains nothing worth waiting for. Allen's corrective to this spiral is not a counsel of optimism, but a prescription of understanding. The man who comprehends the mechanism of the premature conclusion, who can see in real time that the accumulating weight of negative interpretation of the bare surface is itself a planting, and that the harvest of that planting will confirm the very failure he fears, possesses an instrument of navigation that the man who lacks this comprehension cannot access. He can meet the moment of accumulating doubt, not with forced positive thinking, but with a precise and grounded understanding of what phase of the process he is in. He can read the bare surface not as meaningful testimony about the inner process, but as expected testimony about the current phase of a process he understands. The phase in which the most important work is happening in the greatest darkness, with no surface evidence of its activity. This is not a performance of faith. It is the natural inner posture of a man who has understood the law well enough to know that the silent season's most characteristic feature, its silence, is not a message about the productivity of what he planted. It is simply the nature of the phase. The discipline of the dark season, understood in this way, reveals itself as something quite different from what it appears to be from outside. The man who maintains his inner cultivation through the full duration of the silent season, who substitutes thousands of times the thought of genuine abundance for the spontaneous thought of lack, who maintains his private inner standards in the unobserved moments, who meets the accumulating pressure of a bare surface, not with forced positivity, but with the clear-eyed understanding of a man who knows what he planted and what the law will do with it. This man is not suffering through the dark season. He is, in the most precise sense, working it. His maintenance of inner quality during this phase is not endurance. It is cultivation, and the root system it is establishing. The root system of a man who has navigated the full pressure of the dark season without premature conclusion will be, when the spring arrives, among the deepest and most durable root systems available to the human inner life, because it was grown in the hardest conditions through the most demanding phase of the law's operation, by a farmer who understood exactly what the silence contained and chose, with full knowledge of its nature, to tend it anyway. The man who has mastered the harvest principle, in Allen's description, has developed a relationship with the invisible that is not common and not accidental. It is the product of a specific and deliberate inner formation that most people never pursue, not because it is beyond their capacity, but because they have never understood what it requires or recognized its absence as the determining factor in their outer conditions. This relationship with the invisible is not mystical in any vague sense. It is a specific practical competence. The capacity to work without visible reward, to invest inner energy without visible return, and to maintain the quality of the inner field with the same precision and consistency during the phase of invisible operation as during the phase of visible harvest. Not through a suspension of the desire for outer results, but through an understanding of the law that renders the absence of visible results irrelevant as testimony about the state of the inner process. This capacity, Allen is careful to note, is not a gift of temperament. It is not more naturally available to some types of people than to others. It is built through the specific and repeated practice of doing the inner work in the absence of external reinforcement, over a duration long enough that the doing of it in the absence of reinforcement gradually becomes the established default. Each time the farmer tends the field in the dark season without visible return, he does not merely sustain the harvest he is growing. He deepens a second and equally important root system, the root system of inner competence in the dark season itself. The capacity to work the invisible field faithfully is itself a planting. It grows by the same law as everything else the inner field is capable of growing. And the man who plants it consistently across many dark seasons grows a character that is qualitatively different from the character of the man who never had to navigate the invisible. Not superior in any moral sense, but deeper, more stable, and more capable of sustaining the specific kind of inner force that the harvest principle demands at its most advanced stages of operation. The comparison with neighbors whose fields look further along is something Allen addresses as one of the silent season's most corrosive temptations. And it deserves careful treatment here because it operates at a level that is subtler than the more obvious pressures of impatient desire for results. The man whose field is in the invisible season of deep germination will, if he allows his attention to move outward to the surface conditions of other men's lives, encounter evidence that appears to contradict the law he is committed to. Other men seem to be producing visible harvests from shallower work, faster timelines, and inner fields that appear from the outside to be less carefully cultivated than his own. This comparison is not merely discouraging. It is, in Allen's analysis, a specific and targeted assault on the root system of the man's understanding, because it frames the absence of visible surface result not as a phase of the process, but as a disparity between what the law has delivered to others and what it has delivered to him. And if the man receives that framing as accurate, he is planted in the deepest and most personal soil available, the seed of the belief that the law distributes its harvest unequally, and that he, specifically, is on the wrong side of that distribution. Allen's response to this comparison is neither a rejection of the evidence, he does not tell the student to ignore what he sees, nor a promise that patience will eventually produce visible parity with those who appear further along. His response is architectural. The man who is comparing his invisible season to another man's visible harvest is comparing two incomparable things and drawing a conclusion from an incomplete data set. He is seeing the other man's surface, but not his soil. He is seeing the visible harvest, but not the root system that produced it, nor the root systems that may be growing beneath that surface harvest that will, in the fullness of the law's operation, alter the other man's conditions in ways that are not yet visible. The law operates in all fields simultaneously, and it operates with the same impersonal precision in the field of the man, whose visible harvest appears enviable, as it does in the field of the man whose surface is currently bare. The comparison is, therefore, not merely uncomfortable, it is epistemically illegitimate. It concludes from visible surface evidence about an invisible process, and it does so selectively, which makes it the most unreliable instrument of assessment available to the farmer in the dark season. What Allen prescribes as the alternative to external comparison is the inward direction of attention, the practice of looking not outward at other men's surfaces, but inward at the quality of one's own planting and the consistency of one's own tending. This inward direction of attention is not navel-gazing or spiritual self-absorption. It is the practical, functional attention of a farmer who understands that the only field he can cultivate is his own, and that the quality of that cultivation is the only variable in the law's operation that he has any direct influence over. The man whose attention is organized around the quality of his own inner work, who asks in each moment, not whether the surface is showing progress, but whether the planting he made today was genuine, whether the thought he substituted was truly planted or merely recited, whether the private inner standard he maintained in the unobserved moment was the standard that the harvest he intends requires. This man is not waiting for the law to work. He is working the law, and the quality of his work, not the surface testimony of his neighbor's field, is what will determine the harvest he grows. There is a specific inner quality that Allen describes as the natural fruit of sustained navigation of the dark season. A quality that is, in his account, both the product of the cultivation practice and its most important indicator of depth. He describes it as a form of inner certainty that is structurally different from the confidence of the man who has not yet been tested in the dark season. The certainty of the untested man rests on the expectation of visible results. It is conditional, and it is therefore not the deep root of the plant, but a surface attitude that will thin and disappear when the visible results do not arrive on schedule. The certainty that emerges from having genuinely navigated the dark season, from having maintained inner cultivation through the full pressure of bare surfaces, accumulating evidence, and the temptation of premature conclusion, is a certainty rooted in the actual experience of the law's operation. It is the certainty of a man who has planted before, tended through the silence before, and seen the spring arrive with its harvest exactly as the law prescribed. This certainty is not maintained through effort. It has become, through the compounding of verified experience, an automatic assumption, a part of the soil itself, making every subsequent planting deeper by default and every subsequent silent season shorter in its apparent darkness. Because the man now reads the silence not as a test to be endured, but as a phase to be worked. The discipline of the dark season, Allen teaches, extends to a specific practice that most students of his work never explicitly identify. But that is implied in everything he writes about the relationship between inner cultivation and outer harvest, the practice of maintaining the quality of the inner field, not only in the formal moments of deliberate inner work, the chosen moments of meditation, of conscious thought substitution, of deliberate dwelling in the inner atmosphere of abundance, but in the formless, unchosen, in-between moments of the ordinary day, when the inner life defaults to its automatic patterns without the farmer's conscious supervision. It is in these in-between moments that the existing root system of the contrary belief exerts its greatest force, because the farmer's attention is directed elsewhere, and the spontaneous planting of the old root system continues unchecked. Allen's prescription is not that the farmer must maintain constant, vigilant, conscious attention to every thought at every moment. That is not possible, and it is not what the law requires. What the law requires is that the outer layers of the farmer's attention, his character, his habitual inner atmosphere, be cultivated to a sufficient depth that even the unattended in-between moments default to a quality that serves the harvest, rather than one that erodes it. This is the goal of the inner cultivation, not the management of conscious thought, but the transformation of the default inner atmosphere through root establishment deep enough that the character itself becomes the field's primary cultivator. Each choice to maintain the inner standard in a moment of temptation toward the old pattern is not merely a defensive act. It is a deeply generative one. The old root system that the farmer is working against does not thin by being ignored. It thins by being deprived of the continued planting that sustains its depth. Each moment in which the farmer chooses the thought of genuine inner abundance over the spontaneous thought of lack is a moment in which the old root system loses one potential reinforcement, and the new root system gains one actual planting. This is the micro-level arithmetic of the inner field's transformation. Small, individually insignificant, but cumulatively decisive over the duration of the silent season. Allen understood, with the patience of a man who had done the work himself, that the inner field's transformation does not happen in a single decisive planting, no matter how dramatic or sincere. It happens in the accumulation of 10,000 small, unwitnessed, individually unremarkable moments of choosing the right planting over the easy one. That is the discipline of the dark season. That is the work no one watches. And that work, with the precision and faithfulness of the law that governs all planting, is already growing the harvest that the spring will reveal. Allen describes the emergence of the invisible harvest as a threshold event. And the precision of this word, threshold, is worth inhabiting fully before the narration advances, because it carries within it an exact description of the mechanics of visible emergence that most treatments of this phenomenon completely mischaracterize. A threshold is not a gradual transition. It is the point at which the accumulated density of an invisible process crosses from one state into another. A phase transition, in the language of physical science, where the accumulated internal organization of a system reaches a critical point and reorganizes the observable surface in what appears, to anyone who was not monitoring the invisible process, to be a sudden and discontinuous change. Water does not gradually become steam as it approaches its boiling point. It remains water, with increasing internal energy until a precise threshold is crossed and the transition occurs completely. Allen's account of how the invisible inner harvest breaks the surface of visible life follows this exact structural logic. The man who has tended faithfully through the silent season does not, in Allen's account, experience a gradual improvement in his outer conditions, a slow brightening of circumstances, a modest and steady accumulation of outer progress that builds incrementally toward the harvest he was growing. He experiences something of an entirely different character. A break, a moment of visible convergence, in which the accumulated inner work of the silent season crosses a threshold of density and coherence and becomes, abruptly and undeniably, present in the physical world. This is not miraculous, and it is not arbitrary. It is the precise structural consequence of how threshold events work when the invisible process has been tended to full maturity. The convergence does not announce itself in advance. It does not produce preliminary signs that warn the farmer it is coming. It arrives at the threshold with the sudden completeness of a season turning, and it arrives with the force of everything that was growing in the darkness behind it. What does this convergence actually look like in the outer life of the man whose inner field has reached its harvest threshold? Allen does not specify the form, because the form is determined by the specific nature of what was planted, the specific quality of inner abundance, inner capacity, inner worth that the man's cultivation was growing. And that will be particular to each farmer and each field. But the structural character of the convergence is consistent across cases. The resources, the people, the opportunities, and the circumstances that the harvest requires do not arrive sequentially, one at a time, in a polite and organized progression that allows the man to adapt to each new arrival before the next appears. They converge simultaneously from multiple directions at once, with a coherence and a density that the man who did not understand the dark season will inevitably interpret as luck, as timing, as the accidental coincidence of favorable circumstances. The man who planted and tended, however, will receive this convergence with a quality of recognition that is entirely different. He will not be surprised. He will recognize the harvest as the precise and faithful product of the planting he performed in the dark, because he was the one who put it in the ground, and he has understood throughout the silent season what the law was going to do with it. This quality of recognition, the unhurried, unsurprised receiving of the visible harvest by the man who understood the invisible season, is itself one of the most important testimonies to the reality of Allen's law. Because it is the one thing that cannot be faked, cannot be produced through any form of surface performance, and cannot be understood from the outside by anyone who has not done the inner work. The man who has not done genuine cultivation in the dark season will experience the convergence of favorable outer circumstances as an external event. Something that happened to him, something he received from outside, something that could as easily have not happened or could have happened differently. He will be grateful, or relieved, or excited, all of which are the emotional responses of someone relating to an external gift. The man who planted and tended will relate to the convergence as the expression of a law he was working with, as the surface emergence of something he was responsible for, through the specific and disciplined inner work he performed in the silent season. His reception of the harvest is the reception of a man who sent a letter and is reading the reply. He knew a reply would come. He knew its general character, because he chose the words of the original letter carefully. The only thing he did not know in the dark season was the exact day of its arrival. The moment the harvest breaks surface carries within it a specific and important lesson about the relationship between the dark season and the visible one, that Allen intends the student to receive not as comfort, but as instruction for the next planting. The emergence does not conclude the process, it initiates the next cycle of it. The visible harvest, understood correctly, is not the end of the farmer's engagement with the law. It is the confirmation that the law operated as described. and therefore the deepest possible invitation to enter the next dark season with greater understanding, greater depth of cultivation, and greater inner certainty about what the silence contains. The man who receives the harvest as a confirmation of the law and immediately begins the next planting, who treats the visible abundance not as a destination arrived at, but as the surface evidence of a process he has now understood deeply enough to repeat, is the man who, through the compounding of multiple harvests, builds the kind of inner and outer life that appears from the outside as the sustained and stable abundance of a man who has simply been fortunate. He has not been fortunate. He has been farming. In the dark. With the patient, certain knowledge of a man who understood exactly what the silence was growing. James Allen's harvest principle, received in its full depth, reveals something about the structure of the human life that overturns the most foundational assumption of the ordinary mind. The assumption that the outer world is the primary domain of action, and that the inner life is, at best, a supporting condition for outer effectiveness. Allen's law inverts this entirely. The outer world is not the domain of primary action. It is the field of harvest. The inner life is not a supporting condition. It is the soil, the seed, and the farmer, all three simultaneously. And the conversion of poverty of mind into abundance of outer condition is never an event, never a breakthrough, never a single decision that rearranges the conditions of a life. It is a harvest, and every harvest is preceded by a silent season whose duration and depth are determined entirely by the quality of the planting and the consistency of the tending, and whose surface offers, to the impatient eye, no testimony whatsoever to what it contains. The man who abandons the field because he cannot see growth will never know what he was days away from reaping. This is not a consoling idea. It is a precise and consequential fact about the mechanics of the law. The harvest he forfeits is not abstract. It was real. It was growing. And it was at the precise phase of its development at which it was most invisible and most near. The abandonment does not neutralize it. It redirects it into the root system of confirmed failure, into the soil of a man who has now, through the law's faithful operation, grown a crop he did not plant but could not avoid, because the abandonment was itself a planting. And the law does not distinguish between intended and unintended seeds. It grows whatever was planted, without judgment, without exception, without mercy for the man who did not understand what he was planting in the moment of his impatient withdrawal. The man who tends the field with the certainty of a law he has understood will never be surprised by what the spring reveals. Not because he is without doubt. Doubt is a planting available to every man, and the law offers it the same soil as everything else. But because he has cultivated, through the dark seasons he has already navigated, a root system of understanding deep enough to recognize doubt for what it is. A seed, not a verdict. He meets the pressure of the dark season not with the clenched jaw of a man enduring something he cannot control, but with the measured, attentive inner quality of a man who knows exactly which phase of the process he is in, exactly what the law requires of him in this phase, and exactly what the spring will produce from what he is right now, in this unobserved and silent moment, choosing to plant. The spring is not a hope, it is a consequence, and the consequence is already being determined in the darkness where no one is watching. In the invisible field of the inner life, by the only farmer who can work it. Every outer life tells the story of an inner planting. The poverty and the abundance, the constraint and the dominion, the confirmed smallness and the realized capacity. Each is the faithful harvest of a specific inner season. grown in the silence that most people mistake for inactivity, and most impatient minds abandon before it completes its work. The man who comes to Allen's law with the intellectual honesty to read his own outer life as the testimony of his inner field, without evasion, without the attribution of his harvest to forces that had nothing to do with what he planted, has arrived at the only beginning that the law recognizes as real. Not the beginning of a new intention, not the beginning of a new outer strategy, but the beginning of a new inner planting. Deliberate, deep, consistent, and sustained through the full darkness of the silent season, all the way to the surface. That is the harvest principle. That is the one silent law that converts poverty of mind into abundance of outer life. And it has been operating with its full impersonal faithfulness in the inner field of every man who ever lived, including yours, in this precise moment, whether or not you have chosen to understand it. James Allen wrote from the position of a man who had arrived at certainty about the inner life, not through optimism, but through examination, through the sustained, rigorous, and deeply honest investigation of the relationship between what he found in his own inner field and what he observed in the outer conditions of his life and the lives of others. His certainty is not the certainty of a man who wanted things to be a certain way and persuaded himself. It is the certainty of a man who followed the evidence of the law to its logical conclusion and found that conclusion to be both more demanding and more liberating than anything the conventional understanding of life's conditions can offer. More demanding because it removes every external excuse and places the full weight of the harvest in the hands of the farmer. More liberating because it establishes, with the permanence of natural law, that the harvest is always possible, always available, always the precise and faithful product of what the inner field is willing to plant and tend, regardless of the outer conditions in which that field exists. The truth that Allen transmits, in the quiet authority of a man who has understood it past the point of argument, is this: you are always farming. This fact does not depend on your awareness of it. It does not require your participation in any formal practice, your adoption of any particular philosophy, or your decision to take the inner life seriously as a domain of causation. The inner field is always receiving seeds, and the law is always growing whatever is planted in it. The seeds of deliberate cultivation and the seeds of unexamined habit, the seeds of genuine inner abundance and the seeds of automatic lack, the seeds of law-grounded understanding and the seeds of premature conclusion. The only question that Allen's teaching places before the student, the only question that this law, impersonal and faithful as it is, requires the man to answer, is which seeds are receiving the greater and more consistent tending. The silence of the inner life is not emptiness. Allen returns to this principle with every instrument of his philosophical and poetic capacity because he understands that this single misreading, this single equation of silence with absence, is the root cause of every harvest that was abandoned before its time. Every inner cultivation that was discontinued before its root system reached the depth required. Every man who planted genuinely and tended faithfully and then concluded in the precise and tragic timing of the dark season's deepest phase that the law was not working for him. The silence is not the absence of progress. It is progress in its most active, most invisible, most consequential phase. The man who has understood this, genuinely, at the root level of his inner knowing, possesses the one instrument that the harvest principle ultimately requires: the capacity to read the darkness correctly, to work within it without the demand for surface evidence, and to tend the invisible field with the same precision and commitment in the silent season as in the visible one. Allen's teaching on the inner life and its harvest is not a system of thought to be held at an intellectual distance and evaluated for its attractiveness. It is a law, and laws do not wait for evaluation. They operate. The root system of your inner field is establishing itself right now, in this moment, through the quality of the inner life you are actually living. Not the one you intend to live, not the one you have decided to begin tomorrow, but the one you are inhabiting in the unobserved moments of this present day, in the automatic emotional responses you bring to the texture of your ordinary experience, in the unconscious assumptions about what the future holds that operate below the threshold of your conscious awareness. These are your plantings. The law is growing them, faithfully and without exception, in the silence of the inner field. The harvest they will produce is already determined by what has been planted and how deep its root system has grown. The only variable that remains open is what you choose to plant in the next moment. This one, right now, in the darkness where no one is watching. The capacity that Allen ultimately points toward. The capacity that the harvest principle, fully understood and genuinely practiced, develops in the man who commits to it, is not the capacity for positive thinking in any sense that the modern vocabulary has domesticated that phrase into irrelevance. It is something older and more substantial. The capacity for inner dominion. The dominion of the man who has understood that the outer world is his harvest, that the inner life is his field, and that the law connecting the two is not a metaphor or a spiritual preference, but an operative principle of the same order as the laws that govern every other process of growth and development in the natural world. This is the man Allen is pointing toward in everything he writes. Not the man who feels good about his life, not the man who maintains a positive attitude in the face of difficulty, but the man who has taken genuine possession of his inner field, who tends it with the precision and the discipline and the patient certainty of a farmer who understands exactly what he is growing and exactly what the law will do with what he plants. The harvest that Allen's principle makes possible is not a specific outer condition, not a particular form of material abundance, not a defined shape of success that one man can prescribe for another. It is the exact and faithful outer expression of what the inner field, genuinely cultivated, is capable of producing. Which means it is different for every man, as particular as the soil of his character, and as specific as the seeds that his deepest and most genuine inner commitments have planted there. But its essential character, across all its particular forms, is the same. It is the outer life of a man who has understood the silent law and worked it faithfully through the dark season. A life that carries within its structure the unmistakable quality of something grown from the root up, established from the inside out, and produced with the quiet, unhurried, undeniable certainty of a harvest that was never in doubt. Because the farmer understood, from the moment he planted, exactly what the law was going to do with what he put in the ground. The master's voice, through the decades that separate it from this moment, carries no urgency and no special pleading. Allen does not argue for his principle. He states it with the measured authority of a man who has observed its operation too many times and in too many fields to have any remaining doubt about its precision. What he offers is not persuasion. It is a reading of what is already real, an account of a law already operative in every inner life, producing its harvest in every outer one, silent and faithful and completely indifferent to whether the farmer has understood it. The understanding does not activate the law. The law was already active. The understanding changes only one thing: what the farmer chooses to plant. And that choice, small in any given moment, vast in its accumulated consequence, is the entire difference between the poverty of mind that perpetuates itself through unexamined planting and the abundance of outer life that grows with the inevitability of natural law. From a field that was tended through the darkness with precision, discipline, and the patient certainty of a man who had understood what the silence was growing. The question that Allen's harvest principle places before you is not whether the law is real. The law does not require your confirmation. It has been operating in the field of your inner life with complete faithfulness since before you understood it, growing the harvest of what was planted there in the dark. By every thought you held consistently enough to root, every belief you never examined, every automatic response you allowed to plant itself in the unobserved moments of the ordinary day. The question is not whether you are farming. You are always farming. The question is what you are growing. What is growing in the invisible season of your inner life right now? This is not a rhetorical invitation to feel inspired. It is a genuine demand, the kind that the harvest principle places on every man who has understood it deeply enough to know that the bare surface of his present outer conditions is the testimony of a previous season's planting, and that the harvest of his current inner season is being determined right now in the silence of the field that no one else can see or tend on his behalf. The root system that is establishing itself in the deepest strata of your character at this precise moment. The assumptions you are reinforcing through habitual inner repetition, the thoughts you are planting in the in-between moments when your attention is not formally directed. These are the seeds of the harvest that will break the surface of your outer life in the season that follows this one. The only question is whether you know what you planted. The challenge that follows from Allen's law is not a challenge of effort in the ordinary sense. It is not a demand for greater discipline in the outer life, for more effective strategy, or for higher performance in the visible domains. It is a challenge directed entirely at the invisible, at the quality of what is growing in the darkness of the inner field, at the consistency and depth of the cultivation being performed in the unobserved moments, at the root system that is, even now, establishing itself in the bedrock of the character that will produce the next harvest. The challenge is to become the second farmer, the one who works the soil in the cold, who plants in the dark, who tends what cannot be seen, who reads the bare surface of the silent season not as testimony of the law's absence, but as testimony of its most active phase, and who commits, from this moment, to planting only what he genuinely intends to harvest. Leave, in the comments below, 3 words that have appeared in your inner field since this examination began. Write the words, "It grows in darkness," not as a declaration of arrival, but as a planting, a seed deposited in the public field of your expressed commitment, witnessed by the same law that governs every private one. Let those words be the beginning of a new inner season, the season in which you choose, with a clear-eyed understanding of a man who has learned to read the silence, to plant the thought of genuine inner abundance in the deep soil of your character, and to tend it through the darkness with the discipline and patience that every worthy harvest requires. The field is already prepared. The law is already operative. The spring is already determined by what was planted before it arrived. What you plant today, in this moment, in the quiet of the inner life that no other eye can witness, is already on its way to your surface. The darkness is not your obstacle. It is the condition of your harvest. Tend what you cannot see with the certainty of what you know. the rest belongs to the law. And the law has never, in the entire history of its operation, failed to deliver what was planted.